Right Worshipful, Kendall T. Moore, Senior Grand Warden. Right Worshipful Marlon Honeywell, Junior Grand Warden. To all of the elected and appointed Grand Lodge officers, department heads, concordant bodies, and everybody in their rightful place, all of our guests, we welcome you tonight. To everyone, a happy early 17th as we celebrate on this historic day as President Joe Biden has signed Juneteenth to be a federal holiday today. That makes this occasion all the more special. The Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge Foundation is dedicated to furthering the education and crafting the leaders that we want to see in our community today. We want to share our history and tell our history the way that it was meant to be told. And I just thank our board of directors for giving us this amazing opportunity to share with you at this time a wonderful program. We have several guests. First, Gene Rabault, senior high alumnus. We have Ethan with us today. Ethan has grown up with the local community and he believes that community service and solidarity are key aspects of achieving common goals. Ethan is a graduate and the presidential scholar of Edward Waters College with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. As a co-founder of the first president of the Lawyers in Training program, Ethan has helped undergrad students navigate their studies and direct their educations toward attending law school. He is the chair of the District 12 in Duval County Democratic Party and serves as the Legislative Affairs Committee, the Field Committee, and Central Committee. Ethan is planning to attend law school in the fall of 2022. We also have Sean with us. Sean, born in Lubbock, Texas. Sean Anderson is a recent graduate of Edward Waters College, where he majored in criminal justice and minored in psychology. Sean is the co-founder and current president of Edward Waters Pre-Law Club, an organization dedicated to equipping students interested in a career in law with the skills and information required to get into their desired legal career and or law schools. As the son and grandson of principals in low-income schools, he is a perpetual learner driven by his family, the needs of his community, and the opportunities for intellectual enrichment. Sean plans on attending law school in the fall of 2022, where he will study business and family law. I just want to say what an honor it is for us to have these two students with us. They are certainly being the change that they want to see in their communities, and I applaud them for joining us tonight. At this time, I'll now introduce our moderator for the evening. All rise, United States District Court Judge, Middle District of Florida. Currently serving as the United States District Court Judge, Middle District of Florida, Brian J. Davis, age 67, was appointed by President Barack Obama on December 26, 2013. Judge Davis, previously a state circuit court judge, served on the civil, family, juvenile, and probate benches in the historic courthouse of Amelia Island. He has also previously served on the family, juvenile, and civil benches in his hometown of Jacksonville, Florida. He has been a judge for over 27 years. Judge Davis earned a bachelor's degree from Princeton University in 1974, and in 1980, a Juris Doctorate from the University of Florida, serving on the law review and receiving moot court and appellate advocacy honors. He was an active member of the Black Law Student Association and served as a mentor and tutor to the incoming students. Judge Davis practices in the civil and criminal areas of law, labor law, with Mahoney, Hodlow, and Adams as a prosecutor for the 4th District Judicial Circuit, State Attorney's Office, serving as the first African-American Chief Assistant in tort law with Brown, Terrell, and Hogan. Judge Davis has served on the Florida Supreme Court's Governance Work Group, Civil Jury Instruction, Children's Court Improvement, Treatment, base drug court steering and trial performance and accountability committees, and the Florida Bar's Legal Needs of Children Commission in 2002. The American Board of Child Advocates honored him as Judge of the Year. Judge Davis has actively volunteered with leadership in Jacksonville, the Urban League, NAACP. He is a proud member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, Jacksonville Community Council, Hubbard House Help Center, Pace Center for Girls, One Jacks, and the Jaguars Foundation, just to name a few of Judge Davis's memorable contributions in his community. Judge Davis chaired the mayor's 1999 Domestic Violence Task Force, causing significant changes in the treatment of domestic violence victims and cases in Duval County. He is an active supporter of the Urban Scouting, which brings scouting to children without cost. In 2002, Judge Davis co-chaired JCCI's Beyond the Talk, Improving Race Relations study, resulting in an annual race relations progress report for Jacksonville, and in 2009, co-chaired Project Breakthrough, a community leadership initiative against racism. In 2008, Judge Davis helped establish Nassau County's mental health court, then only one of the 10 in Florida, where he presided over a docket designed to prevent the mentally ill from being incarcerated. He currently serves as a Community Foundation trustee and as a board member of the Jacksonville Public Education Fund, and is the executive board member of the North Florida Council Boy Scouts of America. Most importantly, in September 2020, Judge Davis celebrated 44 years of marriage to Tanya, with whom he worships at Ebenezer United Methodist Church. Judge Davis is a grandfather to 5 offspring, 2 children, Brian and Cicely. At this time, I would like to present to some and reintroduce to others, Judge Davis.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for that detailed history. I appreciate you taking the time to share it. And I appreciate more, though, your organization's efforts, the Masons and EWC and FAMU, taking the time to lift up African-American history. I actually become a little reluctant to identify it as African-American history, because in truth, it is American history that simply has been ignored for far too long. So the attention that we all tonight, and hopefully going forward as a community and a state and a nation, will hopefully, as we do go forward, will embrace the history and learn its lessons. That is one of the most important values that history brings to us all, is to, for us not have to repeat the mistakes that have been made, and for us to learn the superlatives and the efforts that have been successful, so that we can benefit from them. So I wanted to take that moment to thank you all for the time that you're spending on this project. Actually, a bit of history is the reason that we're here. Or at least that I'm here helping to explore the life of Joseph E. Lee. As you heard, and I'm not sure whether this was mentioned or not, I'm a native of Jacksonville. I grew up in Grand Park off of Kings Road, not too far from Edward Waters College, actually. And in my childhood, the city recreation department was segregated, as was the entire city at that time, lawfully, by law. Segregation of the races was the order of the day. But city recreation department, though segregated, was very well run and organized. And I had the good fortune of being able to play on every playground, at least black playground, in the city of Jacksonville as a child, because I had a relative that was involved in the management of the system. And every year, all of the parks in the city, the black parks, would have a celebration in which the kids would come from around the city up at if you all are from Jacksonville, you know where I'm talking about, Durkee Field at the corner of 8th and Myrtle. And we would have a play day, essentially, of competitions and ribbons and giving out and the like all day long. It was a great event but it was called Joseph E. Lee Day. And as a child, I had no idea who Joseph E. Lee was. But as I grew into manhood, left Jacksonville, went to school, got a job, came back to Jacksonville, I began digging into local history and discovered who Joseph E. Lee was. And I was absolutely amazed and fascinated and proud of this iconic Jacksonville resident and state and national icon. So I began researching and had the idea, well, I knew of his affiliation with EWC, and my thought was, well, let me see if I can interest some EWC students in trying to help me research this man's life. So Ethan and Sean and a group of other young men and women took up that challenge, and we, for about a year, spent some time doing some active research. And I hope we're going to share, I'm sure we're going to share some of it with you tonight. I'm going to start just by, I'll start at the beginning. We don't know a lot about his childhood, but we do know something. Ethan, why don't you start us off by sharing what we discovered about Joseph E. Lee as a young person?
Yes, sir. And good evening, everybody. So Joseph E. Lee was born September 15th, 1849 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and he had two very loving Christian parents to look after him, and they enrolled him into the Institute for Colored Youth in Cheyney State University, which is also in, which became Cheyney State University. It's located in Philadelphia as well. It's also known as the nation's oldest HBCU. It was founded in 1837. At the time when Joseph E. Lee went to school, coincidentally, the principal of his school was Fannie J. Coppin. She was the first Black woman to ever be a principal of a school here in the United States, which is a very fascinating piece of history. But after completing his coursework at the Institute for Colored Youth, he moved to Washington, D.C., and he attended Howard University to get his undergraduate degree and to also get his law degree, which he obtained in 1873 with high honors.
Ethan, remind me, what year was he born?
He was born in 1849.
I mentioned that for emphasis. You all realize that that was before the Civil War.
Yep.
And I just want to put that in perspective in terms of his life, in meaning that he would have been 20 years old, and you said 1839 and 49. What year was it, Ethan?
He was born in 1849.
49, 50. So he would have been a young man, 20 years old, right after the Civil War. So I just wanted to establish that. About the time that he was graduating from Howard, the Civil War was coming to an end. Sean, do we know what happened after he graduated?
Yes, sir. As you said, that the time, what was happening there in the times was extremely challenging for him. And he came to Jacksonville. He was either 25 or 26 years old. And he really hit the ground running. As soon as he came to Jacksonville, he met up with an Abraham Grant and an Evan R. Scott, who Mr. Russo will tell y'all more about. But they were role models for him, and it helped him instantly, as soon as he came down here, get into the politics of Jacksonville. And by 1874, a year after coming into Jacksonville and graduating law school, he was elected to the Florida House of Representatives.
Now, remember, this is during the country's era of Reconstruction.
Yes, sir.
And there are African Americans with the newly enfranchised vote being protected by federal troops who were stationed throughout the South and including in Jacksonville to protect the vote. resulted in a change in the legislatures of the state and of politics around the state and in the nation. And this young man, early 20s, is thrust into this world. What were some of his early jobs? And I can't remember now, Ethan or Sean, and you all can help me. I know that he eventually became Jacksonville's first judge, but was he involved in other occupations before that?
Yes, sir. As soon as he came to Jacksonville, he started practicing with a AA Knight, and that's where he was using his law degree from. And it was a business law practice, and he had that up. And in 1874, as I said, he was elected to the Florida House of Representatives, and in 1880, he was actually a Florida senator.
He's born in 1839, right?
Mm-hmm.
1849.
49.
How old would he have been when he was elected to the House or to the Senate? Somebody do the math for me.
31.
31 years old. He's still a very young man. But it was the Republican Party that embraced him and that he embraced, because that was the party of Lincoln. That was the anti-slavery party. And it was making serious inroads into the power structure of the state of Florida and the nation and throughout the South under the protection of federal troops. What year did he served in both the Florida House and the Florida Senate, and what next was his move? I believe it was him becoming a judge, or am I mistaken?
He became a judge. Yes, you're correct. So he became a judge in 1888.
Yeah, let me stop Ethan, because I misstated it. He didn't become a judge. He was elected a judge against two white opponents. Is that right?
That is correct. And there's actually a very interesting story about him becoming elected by the city council. There was a city councilman, and his name was Duncan Fletcher. Duncan Fletcher did not like the idea of Joseph E. Lee becoming a judge, especially the first judge for Jacksonville. So he brought up a point of argument that basically said that Judge Lee lives outside the boundaries of Jacksonville, so he cannot possibly be the municipal judge. And Judge Lee wasn't intimidated at all by that argument. In fact, he wanted to give him a run for his money, give Duncan Fletcher a run for his money. And he got some logs and some mules, and he put the logs underneath his house, and he attached his house to the mules, and he drug his house 100 yards to be within the boundaries. Therefore, he was able to become the municipal judge, and the argument that Duncan Fletcher brought forth was moot.
I believe Fletcher High School may have been named after Duncan Fletcher. He is
I think so. Fletcher became a U.S. Senator later on.
Yeah, he's a historical figure in Jacksonville. That ploy, by the way, of you are not in the district you're trying to get elected has repeated itself several times in history and right here in Jacksonville. I remember several races in which that challenge was made. So it's an old political strategy that still has some value to it, at least some practice occurring of it. So he served honorably as a judge. I actually went to the Duval, being a judge and being interested. I went to the clerk's office over in the Duval County Courthouse because I wanted to actually put my hands on some of the papers that he had handled and see his signature and that kind of thing. And the clerk and I searched for half a day actually, and was not able to find anything. But there was an interesting story about why those records don't exist. There was a fire here in Jacksonville that you all may know about in 1901 that destroyed most of Jacksonville and practically the entire African-American community was destroyed. But the courthouse was also burned, and there were records from Judge Lee's term in office as a judge that were destroyed. And apparently, unless there are some hiding somewhere, all of them have been destroyed because we couldn't find them. He rose in prominence here in Jacksonville, but also through the state, and became very active in politics. I think, Sean, you did some research about his affiliation with the Republican Party, did you not?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Okay, so Joseph E. Lee, he was not only very active in the Republican Party in Duval, but on the state and federal levels as well. He was the chairman of the Duval County Republican Party for over 40 years and secretary of the Florida Republican Party throughout the same time period. And he represented Duval at every count, district, and state convention, and was even elected several times to be the representative for national conventions as well.
Yeah, and before we get too deep into that, I want to back up a little bit and invite our latecomer to this conversation, but most valuable contributor, Mr. Urso. He joined us in the research team a little late because of our fault, actually. I just think we didn't reach out to him sooner, and I regret that because he's been a wealth of knowledge. But Joseph E. Lee was not just a lawyer and a judge and a politician. He was deeply rooted in the African-American Episcopal Church and the Masons, and also in EWC. Jerry, can you kind of give us an overview of his involvement in those organizations?
We'll start with the AME Church. So he, when he comes to Jacksonville, he becomes a member of Harmony Lodge #1, and that was a powerhouse of the AME Church. The first 3 Grand Masters of Union Grand Lodge are all members, and he becomes friends with Bishop Abraham Grant. So in his relationship with Bishop Grant, he actually converts to the AME Church and becomes a minister. And one of the communicants of his church at Mount Olive Street was the parents of A. Philip Randolph and A. Philip Randolph himself. So he had a strong relationship and an imprint on A. Philip Randolph early in his life. And as far as the Masonic order goes, he was probably, it's just as much as he was in African-American history in the state of Florida, was probably the most influential Mason in the 47 years that he was a member of this Grand Lodge. And so when he gets here in 1873, Harmony Lodge is under Delaware. So that lodge actually predates Union Grand Lodge being formed on June 21st, 1875. So he's a member of this lodge, and he's, you know, the most influential African-Americans, some of them in history, were members of that lodge. So you have his mentor is Bishop Abraham Grant, who is also the bishop, is Booker T. Washington's mentor. Bishop Grant actually forms or is on the board of trustees for 9 HBCUs. You know, you let that sink in for a minute. Matter of fact, Kentucky Western University's fight song is about Bishop Grant. His other member of the AME Church is John Scott Sr. So John Scott Sr. actually came within 1 vote of being the first African-American to be elected to Congress. And then he lost by about 5 votes when Josiah T. Walls was elected as the first African-American from Florida elected to Congress. So he actually could have been the first African-American period elected to Congress before the election of J. Willis Maynard from Louisiana. Also,
Jerry, let me just stop you for a moment, because I don't know that it's been pointed out, but right behind you is a picture of Joseph E. Lee. I don't know if everybody can see that on the screen, but the gentleman behind him is Joseph E. Lee. And just look how distinguished he looks. You mentioned Bishop Grant. I had the pleasure of reading an introduction that Joseph E. Lee made of Bishop Grant. And I think it was in connection with a Masonic, if it wasn't a Masonic function, it was an AME church function. And it was just the introduction of another person was a powerful and moving oratory. The language was just beautiful. And I took from that and from this picture that he had to have been a man of tremendous presence and charisma and personality to do all of the things that he did in the short time that he was on this earth. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to kind of provide a little personal context, Jerry. Continue though, if you would.
But Reverend Randolph, A. Philip Randolph's father, said that the three most influential persons in his life was Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Joseph E. Lee. And as far as the oratory goes, he just follows this legacy. When you think about Tillman Valentine, Bishop Grant, Joseph E. Lee, John R. Scott, if you ever get to read their speeches, these guys were Shakespeare.
Frederick Douglass. Don't leave Frederick Douglass out.
Okay, absolutely Frederick Douglass. But they were just such great orators, and it just left such an impact on everyone that heard Judge Lee speak that they would never forget the rest of their life of having the opportunity to have heard him speak.
Yep. Now, we discovered that he and not only was influential in the establishment of EWC, and that, of course, would have been in connection with his emphasis on that I have read. He placed on education and youth generally, excuse me, but also the AME Church. But interestingly, and we haven't been able to find out any more about this, but I am dying to. So if you all have resources that might help illuminate this, please share them with us. He established a law department at EWC. Isn't that right?
He was the first professor of law.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. Talking about his influence, I know we haven't talked about. I'm not convinced you all are as impressed yet as I am of him, but I've got a couple of stories that I know Sean and Ethan know about the circle that he ran in that included presidents of the United States. Talk about that for a little bit, either of you.
Okay, yeah. He was extremely influential, as Judge Davis just said. He knew presidents. When President Theodore Roosevelt visited Jacksonville in 1905, he was looking forward to seeing two people, a former war buddy and the current governor, and Joseph E. Lee, this notorious Black Republican who was causing all this trouble. And when Roosevelt arrived via train, at the train station, there was over 250 prominent Jacksonville citizens at the time, but Joseph E. Lee wasn't invited. And all of those prominent citizens, all 250 of them were white. And so that's the leading reason why Joseph E. Lee wasn't invited. But during his visit of Jacksonville, Roosevelt was touring the residential area of Jacksonville, and he cut his tour short and went to Lee's home and personally visited Lee and his family at his house, which is a president of the United States came and visited him at his own house. And then later that same day, he went to St. Augustine, and he had lunch with President Roosevelt, and he was the only Black man in attendance, the only Black person in attendance for that St. Augustine luncheon. He
was also a super big pen pal with President Roosevelt as well. So that's how they were able to have that relationship. When he came to Jacksonville, he knew of Joseph E. Lee. He's the main person that he's in correspondence with here in the city.
But Joseph E. Lee was probably closer to President McKinley, William McKinley. He was known, it was well known that Lee was one of the only Floridians with easy access to McKinley. He could see McKinley pretty much whenever he wanted. And we later found out This is because Lee was instrumental in McKinley's nomination by the Republican Party and consequently as the President of the United States. Mark Hanna, then he was kind of known as the Republican kingmaker. He met with Lee, and Lee was able to assure him that he would be supported by the Florida Republicans. So Lee was so influential and had the power and the backing that he was able to give this potential president the word of all of the Florida Republicans. And McKinley actually announced his presidency in Jacksonville based on Lee's power.
Now, I'm going to try to put this in context too. Around what year would that have been? I had a time line at one point, but this has got to be in the early 1900s.
1897 to 1901, Judge.
In 1901, was McKinley?
Yes, sir. And one of the interesting stories about that, after McKinley is inaugurated, the first Memorial Day, he hosts Abraham Grant and Joseph E. Lee to Washington, where they ride in the presidential coach and tour Arlington Cemetery and lay a wreath for veterans of the Civil War, colored troops of the Civil War. And even though it wasn't recorded in the newspapers, this is long before the presidential luncheon of Booker T. Washington that was recorded as the first Black man to dine at the White House, when, according to the papers of Bishop Grant, Joseph E. Lee and Bishop Grant probably most likely were.
Let me again try to put this in context. The Compromise of 1877 was what resulted in the federal troops being withdrawn from the South. And Reconstruction slowly transformed into Black codes and the Jim Crow roots of legal segregation that would last for another 70, 80 years legally. 1901, if I'm not mistaken, or around the turn of the century, is the country's witnessing the birth of a nation. It may have been after that. It was probably a little bit later in the early 1900s that film that lifted up the Ku Klux Klan and portrayed the African-American legislators of the period as absolute buffoons was a cultural watershed moment in the United States as far as the psyche of most white Americans are concerned. This is the context that Joseph E. Lee is operating in. He survived Reconstruction and he survived Jim Crow at its height. And he did it while continuing to focus on the edification and uplift of Black people. One of the controversies that occurred during, I believe it was Roosevelt's administration, was a complaint that, and Ethan, I see you shaking your head. Tell them about it.
Right. So there are a lot of people, especially down south in Florida, who complained a lot to the president about Joseph E. Lee because he was a Black man who was appointing other Black men to positions of power. And therefore, they were complaining to the president. And the president received these complaints, and he looked at them and he goes, well, I like the work that Joseph E. Lee is doing, and I'm going to keep him. And he actually made some rearrangements with the folks that he had in positions of power. So even though he made the rearrangements and to kind of appease those complaints, he kept Joseph E. Lee. And luckily, Sean and I, we were so privileged to be able to hold the newspaper that actually said Joseph E. Lee is causing a stir, and the president's having to respond to it.
Mm-hmm.
And responded in support of Joseph E. Lee.
Correct.
He said that he was satisfied with the work that Lee was doing and the work of everybody he appointed.
Yep.
And while he was a judge, A. Philip Randolph's father took him to the courthouse so they could see what a Black man looked like that had a Black judge looked like that had white clerks working for him, so he knew what he could strive for later in life.
Well, you know, I read somewhere that, and I've read James Weldon Johnson's biography because he talks a lot about Jacksonville. As a matter of fact, he talks about Jacksonville transforming from being a egalitarian, progressive community to one that was reactionary and becoming more racist around this time in his biography. But he also talks about Joseph E. Lee being one of the men that he wished to emulate as a person and as a public servant because of his stature, because of his influence, and because of his character. Um, One of the things we haven't talked about, and this kind of also just added another real interesting dimension to him for me. And you all haven't heard a word about his family, but he had a family. He was married, and who Sean, do you or Ethan want to talk about that a little bit?
I can speak on his family. Yes, sir. As Judge Davis said, yes, he was married. He got married a year after coming to Jacksonville. So that's 1874. By all accounts that we've seen, he had a wonderful, blessed Christian marriage, but 5 out of 6 of his children unfortunately died before reaching the age of 18. And only his one daughter, Frances Lee, survived him and his wife.
Now, can you imagine that? You know, I have trouble wrapping my head around that. I don't know if y'all are parents, and if you're not parents, you had parents, so you might be able to relate even if you're not a parent. But, you know, parents are supposed to die before their children do. And yeah, it is one of the most horrible things that can happen to an adult and and a parent is to lose a child. He lost 5 children at young ages. I cannot imagine the emotional toll that that took. And, you know, sometimes that kind of grief and burden can serve as a, you know, as a motivator for you to focus on something else. And I don't know, I just try to figure out how he could, you know, manage to do as much as he did and have those kind of personal tragedies in his life.
He had the faith of Job.
That's true. He did. He was deeply rooted in his faith in God was unshakable. We haven't talked much about. I mean, we kind of made reference, Jared, to his Masonic work. Do you? But I know we just scratched the surface. Do you want to share a little bit more
Sure.
about that?
So he becomes immediately a member of the Committee on Jurisprudence, and he holds that position for 47 years. He's on the Committee for Jurisprudence for the Grand Lodge, as well as. So let me get back up a little bit. So I was looking when I first started doing my Masonic research 11 years ago. There's a name on the cornerstone, and it's Joseph C. Lee. And I'm looking through records, and there's no such person as Joseph C. Lee. And I'm going through the Masonic rolls, and I can't find a Joseph C. Lee. So evidently, on the cornerstone, they got his name wrong. But he was actually the Grand Senior Warden when the building was built, when the construction was completed in 1912. And he was one of the leading components to raising money to erect that building. So to put that in context, his lodge burnt to the ground. So Harmony Lodge built the first lodge, which became the Grand Lodge, which was located on Orange and Julia Street, which is the parking lot for Florida State College of Jacksonville, which is right across the street from Bethel Baptist. So when that building burnt to the ground, it was actually Julia Street was the last street of the edge of the fire, to put that in perspective. So, I mean, it was one of the last buildings to burn. So it was a 12-year process. So when the building got done, he invites W.E.B. Du Bois to Jacksonville, and Du Bois calls that building the finest building owned by African Americans anywhere in the South. So his one day we'll have to straighten that C to an E, but it was Joseph E. Lee's, whose name is the third name on the cornerstone of the Grand Lodge. And can we tell them where your office sits, Judge?
Yeah, it sits where the old Woolworth building used to. In fact, right across from now the James Weldon Johnson Park in the city of the city. But I have a bird's eye view of the Masonic building, which you know, this kind of history makes me so proud. How many people in Jacksonville do you think know Joseph E. Lee was responsible for W.E.B. Du Bois coming to Jacksonville and saying that Jacksonville has the finest African American building in the nation? I mean, that kind of history is not widely known at all, even among the African American community. And it's the kind of stuff that just makes me proud that, you know, I want to help disseminate. Talking about being involved in perpetuating history generally, Jerry. One of the things that we came to learn is that we weren't the first group of African Americans to take a genuine interest. I mentioned the city recreation department, and in segregation days had him as the celebration in the city for children for many, many years. It wasn't just when I was a child, it went on for some time. But there was a lawyer here, Mr. Ike Williams, who's now deceased, who published a local newspaper in the African American community back in the 1960s and 70s. Excuse me. And he took a genuine interest in Joseph E. Lee. He went out and interviewed people who knew Joseph E. Lee, who actually met the man. He collected Joseph E. Lee's papers that he could find. And he actually lobbied the state of Florida and the city of Jacksonville to help fund a museum. And the museum came into existence. Do either of you want to talk more about that, Sean or Ethan? I know because somebody knows about the daycare. Is the daycare associated with it?
It is. So when we were working with the Historical Society, we found the document that they submitted to the city council at the time, and it was for the feasibility study of opening that memorial for Joseph E. Lee. And as you said, in the feasibility study, it had records, and it said that they spoke with Ike Williams went out and spoke with and recorded hundreds of conversations concerning Joseph E. Lee and documents and pictures and all that. And they wanted, with the memorial, they wanted to open a children's center next to it because Joseph E. Lee, he was always focused on community outreach. And they thought that having the kids there right next to that source of information would have the sort of community outreach that Joseph E. Lee was wanting, that he lived for.
And as inattention and the lack of concern about history generally would cause, the museum actually was torn down. I went looking for it, and where it once stood, the expressway through its expansion over on the east side apparently took the land and the building that constituted the museum. The materials that were in it, there's some articles that we located that talked about there being an effort to capture those before the museum's demise and store them somewhere. Some of them have shown up, but we haven't been able to find the recordings or the records of the conversations of people, and much of it is still a mystery. The Ritz Theater had some, and they shared what they had, but we're still on the lookout for any kind of records that relate to that museum and the papers that were in it. Joseph E. Lee had an active law practice in addition to everything we've already talked about. That was how he supported himself. He represented Black and white people across the state of Florida. And this, this is at a time when that was not only the exception, it was an unheard of exception. I suspect he was among very few African Americans who were practicing law at that time. There were a few. I've got a book that outlines the early lawyers of the state, but they were certainly the exception. His law practice, we ran across some of the invitations that he issued to his law practice's opening, because the later part of his life, I think, was spent, practicing law and continuing to be involved in politics here locally.
One of the interesting facts about that is the fact that he was a Howard graduate is the reason why he was able to practice law in Reconstruction Florida. There was an unwritten rule when they started calling the black codes before Jim Crow, but it was increasingly difficult to become a member of the Florida bar. But being a Howard graduate, all Howard graduates would be members of the United States bar. In the way the Florida Constitution was written, that any member of the federal bar was automatically a member of the state bar. So that's why there was always some confusion about James Weldon Johnson being the first African American to pass the bar. It was the first African American to pass the bar since Reconstruction.
Right.
And him and his law partner, J. Douglas Wetmore, who's probably the greatest civil rights attorney in history, also follows in that line that all pay tribute to Joseph E. Lee. Think about the line of all these great civil rights lawyers that came from our Grand Lodge, all the way to currently with Benjamin Crump. You have both the McGills, Samuel Decatur and Nathaniel McGill, all pay tribute to Joseph E. Lee. When Judge Lee was writing letters to Samuel McGill when he was at Edward Waters College, encouraging him in his study, he also influences A. Philip Randolph, James Weldon Johnson, and Judge Leander Shaw, who became the first state Supreme Court justice, who had his law office in the same building, 410 Broad Street. And for a short period of time, Joseph E. Lee had his office next to D.W. Perkins on the second floor of the Grand Lodge.
And the African American Bar Association here in Jacksonville is named after D.W.
Perkins.
Right. The sad news is that, and I say it's sad, it may be exactly how he would have wanted it, but he died in his law office at work. And he's buried. There's some interesting facts surrounding his burial as well. He's buried here in Jacksonville in the old city cemetery. But Jerry, why don't you add a twist to that for us?
So when the cemetery was created, there's a dirt road, and one side of the cemetery was called Old Negro Cemetery, and the other side was the Confederate, or where all the Confederates were buried at Old City Cemetery. And Judge Lee is buried on the white side of the cemetery, which was considered a place of honor. I think there's only 4 African Americans that are buried on that side. One would be Eartha and Clara White. Then it would be Emmanuel Fortune, father of T. Thomas Fortune, and a political ally of Judge Lee, who was also a senator representative from Florida. He was actually one of the leaders of the Jackson County Wars. So for those of you familiar with that racial portion of Jacksonville history, that's how the Fortune family comes to Jacksonville and Judge Lee.
Jerry, I don't know how much time you intended for this discussion to go on. We've been at it now for about 50 minutes. Perhaps we should leave a little bit of time for questioning, but in closing, I would say that, I'm convinced that part of the reason that we are as divided as a country as we are is that the truth hasn't been told. And there is a very concerted effort to I don't want to say prevent the truth from being told, but to color it in a way that that does not shed the kind of light that needs to be shed on the history of African Americans and their contributions to this country, and the system's response to the color of their skin. And so I'm so, if you all don't leave with anything else, just know that I have your appreciation in collecting yourselves to learn a little bit about a figure who is deserving of our respect and emulation. What I hope you do is, be invigorated as I am, and I think now Ethan and Sean are, to, keep digging this history up and keep telling it and keep sharing it. And we made a film. I don't know if Jerry told you that I'm hoping to disseminate throughout the school system about Joseph E. Lee, so that Black and white kids can learn about the issues, the dynamics, the successes, the failures, the horrors that make us who we are. And, as I said, we can learn from the mistakes that were made, and we can benefit from the successes. So thank you all for the opportunity. And I don't know, Jerry, do you want to talk?
I'm going to give Sean and Ethan a chance for final comments, and I'll make a final comment, and then we'll turn it over to our president, and then we can take questions from the audience for a few minutes.
Very good.
Sure. I would like to say that working on this research project was one of the best things I've ever done in my life. I was able to learn history firsthand from primary sources. I felt like a historian, and to be able to work with a federal judge and to be able to work with the lodge on this issue is just, it's very important to get this history out there. And I've learned so much, not only about the history of Jacksonville working on this project and how well the history could be told, but I've also learned, qualities of a man from Joseph E. Lee. So overall, this experience has been one of the greatest ones that I've had.
Yeah, as Ethan said, it was an amazing opportunity, and we learned so much. Like he said, the Historical Society, working with those firsthand documents, that was a bit of a challenge. But overall, it was amazing, and it was really fun, and I learned so much.
Before I close, I just really wanted to say, usually I do these presentations on PowerPoint presentation with documents and photos, but I thought it would be robbery not to highlight these two young men's faces, so everybody could see that they took an interest in one of our members, working with the Honorable Judge Davis, especially sitting at a conference room where we're at 6 o'clock in front of the Grand Lodge, 11 stories up. It's probably the best view of the Grand Lodge I ever seen, and we're discussing probably the greatest Prince Hall Mason of this jurisdiction. In the process, when we were filming that documentary, was just overwhelming for me, and I just really appreciate working with this collection of talent. I'm going to close with this. Just yesterday, I found a new document, and this is from our most worshipful Grandmaster, Reuben Mitchell, and he's introducing Brother Joseph E. Lee in a short but he called it a logical but forcible speech, that those that know Brother Lee as a speaker know that he was a profound reasoner and a ready talker. The history of the order and the presence of the status of Negro Masonry in the United States will long be remembered, in which Brother Lee was so easily simplified. So with that, I will say I follow in Joseph E. Lee, because technically that makes him the first grand historian of the most worshipful Union Grand Lodge. I had to throw that in there. Okay, Brandon, we'll take questions from the audience now, sir, and turn it over to you.
Absolutely. First, I just want to give, again, a big, huge congratulations to our students, Ethan and Sean. We truly appreciate your efforts. To Judge Davis, absolutely fantastic. I know that if it were not for Lee's sacrifices and your sacrifices and those like you, that I would not be able to have followed in all of your great footsteps and to attend law school and become an attorney myself. So I am eternally grateful for this journey, and it definitely has a personal impact on my life. And to always our grand historian, an amazing job in supporting the efforts, continuing our journey as the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge Foundation attempts to tell the history of its members and the great sacrifices and tremendous resolve that we've had over the community for a number of years. So at this time, we'll open the floor for questions. Thank you guys again for joining us.
Well, brothers, President, I wanted to ask the panel, and thank you, wonderful, wonderful job. I wanted to ask, is there anything, there was a recent recent thing with the city of Jacksonville renaming schools. They renamed Robert E. Lee School to something else, and they talked about Ribault High School changing names. They didn't do that. Was there any effort to name a school, or is there already a school named after this?
I guess I'll take that. Yes, I submitted the name of changing. I thought it would be easier for the city to change the name to Joseph E. Lee, but in the final analysis, the city decided to use non-political names, and they didn't use any persons, black or white, so they wouldn't create no controversy. So all the renamings of the schools are very generic. The only markers left in honor of Joseph E. Lee is the cornerstone on 410 Broad Street and the historical marker right over my left shoulder, which is located on East 17th Street in Jacksonville in front of his home.
No, Jerry, is it still there?
I'm pretty sure it's still there.
My research suggested that it had been pilfered. Really? And that no one knows where it is. What's the gentleman, Ethan and Sean, you can help me remember, gentleman that worked with us at the Historical Society.
What now?
You know what I'm talking about.
Alan Bliss?
Yeah, Alan Bliss. Alan Bliss, I think, shared with me some materials that said that, because he checked with the person who was responsible for the historical markers, because we had discovered an article that said that it could not be found. There are pictures of it, but that the marker itself is missing. And that may be a a project that we might want to undertake.
It's only $2,500. Someone is
history about the school naming. That rule that they relied on to avoid naming the school after Joseph E. Lee or any other living person had been in effect for a while, and it actually resulted from the effort that resulted in what was the Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan that we had a school named after here?
Nathaniel Forrest.
Yeah, Nathan B. Forrest. When that change happened, because that preceded this effort to change all of them by some years, consequences of that was we'll change this name, but we're not going to ever name another school after another person again. And I learned that because I was petitioning the school system to name one of these schools that was named after a street. I live off of Dunn Avenue and Biscayne Boulevard. There's Biscayne Elementary, named after the street that I live off of. And I wanted it to be named after Wendell P. Holmes, because he was the first African-American superintendent, and first African-American chairman of the Duval County School Board. And I ran into that rule then, that was why they couldn't change the name.
They're going to be taking submissions for 6 historical markers at the original spot where Stanton High School was. Right. Not where the present one is, but the original. There's a park. I think they have the James Russell Johnson and James. They have some markers there.
Clay and Ashley.
Yeah, they're taking submission, because I had submitted Joseph E. Lee's name. I submitted Abraham Grant. I submitted Tillman Valentine, and Ada Braddock, and Tillman Valentine's daughter, Janaea Valentine, is when I was part of the Civil Rights Task Force, we were talking about renaming some stuff. So those were the names I submitted. It's only $2,500 to buy a historical marker. It's not that much money.
Yeah, Joseph E. Lee should be. We should maybe put together an effort to try to get another one.
I mean, since he was located, I'm sure, we have plenty of space on Church and Broad Street where they could put historical markers up, since he had his law office at 410 at one point.
Yeah, yeah.
And that picture you like so much, that is actually from the University of Massachusetts W.E.B. Du Bois collection, and that was President Scott, president of Edward Waters College at the time. He was also the grand venerable patron of the Union, I think at the time it was called the Union Chapter of Heroines of Jericho. He was the grand venerable patron. So he actually wrote it on this venerable, on the Heroine of Jericho stationery to submit a letter to Joseph E. Lee's wife to make sure he was included in the 1920 Crisis magazine. His obituary was included, and that's the picture that was in the Crisis magazine.
Okay.
It looks like we have 3 more questions that we're going to be able to take. I have 3 individuals that rose their hand, and then we will conclude. Can we get Christopher Irvin? You have your hand raised. Okay, moving on to brother Kerry Smalls. You had your hand raised.
Yes, good evening, brothers. This program was a wonderful program to sit and listen to. Honorable Judge Davis and Grand Historian Worshipful, I was wondering if there were any lodges that had been or are named after Brother Lee, by chance.
I have looked through so he died in 1920, and so there weren't any beforehand named after him. And at the height, we were like 20,000 strong. I think we had over 450 lodges around that time, so it's possible. But the problem is, there's so many of those we don't have many records from 1910 to 1960. There's not a whole lot of records. Those were the records that were lost during the renovation.
We have one more question from Brother Brian L. Armstrong, and then we will close out.
Awesome job to this panel. You did a great job. And I just want to give you a little support as far as there may be a marker on the east side where the Honorable Judge was speaking of, where the preschool that was named for him back in the 70s, and it may still be in existence now, but I remember there being a marker there, and it's adjacent to Cougar Park on the east side. I know the extension, the 95 extension runs through there, but I remember seeing it years ago. And it could have been probably 10 or 15 years ago. So, Brother Jerry, good job, and everyone else.
Thank you, Brian. If you happen to, run across that marker, as I said, I went and looked, but I couldn't find it, and I don't know that I exhausted the area in my search, but would be wonderful if we could locate it. And if we can't locate it, it'd be wonderful if we somehow get it duplicated. That should be a fairly easy process because the work for its, creation has already been done.
You know what's interesting, Judge, is how Confederate Point actually got its name, and it was during the speech of Frederick Douglass. So when the Frederick Douglass does his whistle stop tour through the South, he comes to Jacksonville, and they had the same day between 8 and 9,000 honoring the Confederates, and they were giving speeches that day. And the same day, across the street, where from Confederate Point, they had 20,000 African Americans come to hear Frederick Douglass, and Joseph E. Lee introduces Frederick Douglass. And as much noise and hoop and hollering the Confederates did, they couldn't. The African American crowd dwarfed them and silenced them. They couldn't hear anything across the street because the crowd downtown on Main Street was so vibrant to hear Frederick Douglass. And in the audience that day was James Weldon Johnson.
Yeah, Brandon, I'm gonna make this last point if you'll allow me, and then I'm gonna shut up. I can talk about this all night.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I can't talk about it as long as the grand historian can. Believe me, that story would not have appeared in the papers here in Jacksonville, Florida. The Pittsburgh Courier might have picked it up, and much of the history of the South in the African American communities was reported nationally, but not locally. Except after years ago, there was a newspaper called the Tatler, but before that, there was the Florida Star has been in existence for a while.
The
Metropolis. But even before that, there was not a means for Black people. See, that story is powerful. You got, 20,000 African Americans and a couple of thousand Confederates. That's kind of the kind of collection of facts that, I want to see us lift up and say, we weren't a backwards, we were an oppressed, but not a backwards and not an inactive community whatsoever.
During that speech, they owned 51% of the property in Jacksonville.
Yep.
Absolutely. It's just so phenomenal, the power that we've had as we continue to deal with some of the same issues that they were dealing with back then today. And so it is just absolutely empowering, but the challenge is for us to do more, right? The challenge is with all of the resources that we currently have and all of the technology and information that is now available. It is upon us to ensure that those sacrifices made by those individuals is not in vain. And so I challenge everybody on this call tonight in your own special way to continue that cause. And to share that history. And if this message tonight was something you learned that you did not know, share it with others and spread the news of all of the great, phenomenal educational programming that the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge has in store. And so I say to you all now, thank you for your time. We appreciate each and every person on this call. Thank you for supporting us. Special thank you again to the students, to our grand historian, Brother Urso, and to our federal judge, Judge Davis. We certainly appreciate you, and everyone have a great and blessed night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, brother.